I don't think people quite understand how surreal it is to be accused of being a serial killer.
If you were having another child and you knew that Lucy Letby was going to be the nurse at that hospital, would you do it there?
I didn't know what to think going into this. I encountered journalists who just were like, you know what, there may be more to this story, but we can't touch it. I've become disturbed, not just how misleading it was, but also how intentionally misleading it was. The police hired a statistician. She gave her report to them, and the prosecution removed her from the investigation. They just didn't like the answer, and so they got rid of it.
The most damning piece of evidence. I am evil, I did this. What was going on there?
I went through the exact same process in prison. Dr. Jairam testified to being the one person to have caught her red-handed, standing over a baby, but his own notes from when this actually happened, Lucy Letby had called. She was blowing the whistle on, we're just gonna blame you for the deaths. It got out of control.
I just found out that the past month, YouTube has been stifling the reach of my videos to new viewers. The same is happening to my peers in this space. If you believe in the Heretics mission, support the channel by clicking subscribe.
Lucy Letby, you think she might be innocent?
Yes. I think that there's a very strong possibility that this is an innocent woman who is sitting in prison for the rest of her life. And it's, I didn't come to this story thinking one way or the other, right? In fact, I didn't even come to this story. The story came to me in a big way. A lot of people reached out to me just to say, hey, we think your eyes should be on this case because we haven't seen a woman accused of a heinous crime based on circumstantial evidence be treated this way in the British media since you. And so we're just seeing echoes of Amanda Knox happening in the Lucy Letby case. Can you have your eyes on it? Wow. And that was years ago. And so I started just paying attention. But of course, I'm not a medical expert. I'm not a statistician. It took a long time for me to wrap my mind around what this case is. And of course, it's not just like a case of one person dying. There are numerous babies that have died. There are numerous babies that have collapsed and then survived. So it's a very complicated case. But what has emerged, and I think it is emerging with time, is that what was presented to the jury was not the complete picture of what happened in this hospital. And indeed, what is happening all over in England with the NHS.
Interesting. Do you remember the moment that came into was it your inbox? Was that how that happened?
Yes, yeah. It wasn't the DMs. No one was slipping in my DMs. Yeah, someone reached out, I think through my website, because I have a contact form on my website that anyone can directly email me that way. And they just said, hey, it was right after she was convicted. And the headlines are going wild, serial killer. And immediately, and it's interesting, I actually reached out to other wrongly convicted women who I'm now good friends with. And I asked them, do you guys have your eyes on this case? Like, because, in the wrongly convicted community, there are quite a lot of us in the United States, hundreds and hundreds of us. And there's a small group of us, women, because women are not typically the ones who are getting wrongly convicted. We're not typically the ones who are getting convicted at all. But the kinds of things that we see happening in women's cases are very different than the kinds of things that we see in men's cases. I don't know if you know this already, but like women, 2/3 of the time are wrongly convicted of crimes that never even happened in the first place. So no crime occurred. And there was a mistaken diagnosis that a crime occurred, and then the fault fell on the nearest woman.
I see.
And
witch hunting.
Well, yeah, and I think that, and a sort of jumping to conclusions about like something tragic occurs. And again, this very often happens with children. So a child is injured or dies unexpectedly. And the immediate assumption is that there's some caretaker, the immediate caretaker, actually, usually the one who brought them to the hospital to get treated, is assumed to have done something to them. And then there isn't a follow-up to examine, were there underlying conditions? Was there something else going on? Or could this have been an accident? Like there's a lot of, kids will show up, like frantic mothers will be bringing their kids into the hospital. And, there's this tragic case of a mother who was put on death row in the United States, whose son collapsed. And she was attempting life-saving measures on her son, including doing like CPR on her son. She's not a trained CPR person, but she's doing her best. And because he had bruising from the CPR, ultimately what they said in court was that she had stepped on her son and crushed him to death, when in fact, years later, they realized that he had a kidney condition and that had killed him. But because they saw bruising, they saw a baby, they assumed the mother did it. She's a poor Black woman in the United States. The immediate assumption is that some harm was inflicted upon the child as opposed to there being some kind of more complicated medical underlying condition to explain what had happened. And so you see that in a lot of women's cases. And I think the Lucy Letby case is it follows that same playbook of, here we have babies who we want to assume were stable and were on their way to, getting out of the NICU and being able to go home with their parents. And then suddenly, unexpectedly, they are collapsing, they are dying. There's a spike in this hospital. What is going on? It must be intentional, as opposed to maybe something is not fit at the hospital. And I think that in this case, that immediate assumption that the explanation must be intentional harm inflicted led to confirmation bias in the course of the investigation, where they were looking for signs of inflicted harm and ignoring signs of underlying conditions.
So people will be screaming at their TVs now,
Yes.
saying, wow, hang on, there's the most damning piece of evidence, the one that we all saw in the newspapers. I didn't look into the case. I saw bits in the newspapers and I went, oh, well, she did it then. As I did with you, I think at the time. I was very young. Well, not that young, actually.
What's our age difference, by the way?
I think
forget.
a couple of years. I'm 37.
Oh, I'm 38. So we're
it's only
basically the
1
same
year.
time. Yeah.
Well,
Wait, am I 39? No, I'm 38.
I took an interest because I think then the year below you, and I was at Leeds University, and I did the Erasmus course as well, like Meredith Kircher. So
Yeah.
I was fully invested in that when I was 18 or 19, I suppose, or something.
This was so close. Like it could have been you.
Yeah, absolutely. Different circles. I went to France in the end, and you guys were in Italy. But people will be screaming at the TV going, okay, the damning piece of evidence, this is the thing. The thing in the papers was, I am evil, I did this. This was scrawled all over what looked like unhinged notes. So what was going on there?
Yeah. Oh, I'm so glad you brought this up, because this is the piece of evidence that I knew everyone would focus their attention on. And it's almost like it was meant to be a kind of distraction from the lack of definitive medical evidence in this case, in a similar way that my own false confession or confession, these statements that the police coerced me to sign over the course of hours and hours of an illegal interrogation. People point to that and say an innocent person doesn't write or say this kind of thing. So no matter how circumstantial all of the actual physical evidence in this case, that really is ultimately what it comes down to, is what is the personality of this person? What is her inner, how has she betrayed herself and revealed her homicidal intentions? I think that was, I absolutely believe that I never would have been arrested or accused of murder had I not been put through an illegal interrogation and coerced into signing those statements. I never would have been arrested. And I don't think I ever would have been convicted or sent to prison at all if it wasn't for that confession evidence, because it's so compelling to people, confession evidence. And in this case, once again, we see, headlines, she confessed, like here it is in her own handwriting. But very much like the medical evidence in this case, this evidence is completely stripped of its context. So, and I'm, you've done a little bit of research into this case, so you know the context, but there are a lot of things that she wrote in the months after she was being sort of thrown out by her colleagues, accused by her colleagues. This is a woman who spent her whole life striving to be a neonatal nurse, who's suddenly being blamed either by being a bad nurse for the deaths of babies or being intentionally hurting babies. She is in an existential crisis as all of these people around her are turning against her. And she's attempting to defend herself. No one is believing her. And she is freaking out. And I think that what I recognize in those notes is the process of someone grieving and trying to make sense of a really difficult and surreal situation. And I actually, for the podcast and my own podcast, Doubt, about this whole case, I reached out to other, again, wrongly convicted women to ask if they had insight into this particular question. Because for me, I do not look at that and I see an automatic sign of a confession. Here is the thought process of a guilty person. What I see is the thought process of someone who is in pain, who is trying to understand why people think she's a bad person. I went through the exact same process actually in prison. It was after I was, interrogated and put through that whole horrible situation. In prison, I started to think crazy things like, oh, maybe because again, you're like, why is this happening to me? Why do people think I'm bad? I don't understand. And I started to even think, well, maybe everyone is supposed to suffer a certain amount in their life, and all of my suffering is just happening all at once. And am I a bad person and I just don't understand? Like, what is going on here? I knew that I was innocent and I had nothing to do with this, but you internalize a lot of that blame that is coming your way, and a lot of that self-hatred is happening because it's hard to confront the world when you feel like it's turning against you, and you almost feel like the impulse to turn against yourself. So I reached out to other wrongly convicted women and asked them, like, when you were going through this, you did not commit a crime at all, but at any point, did you have any like weird thoughts of like self-blame? And yes, 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 and yes. Like people thinking, well, maybe I'm going through this because I'm just not good enough. And even if I didn't commit this crime, like maybe I deserve it somehow. I don't think people quite understand how surreal it is to be accused of being a serial killer when you didn't. And like, for me, ultimately, what this comes down to is that piece of evidence, much like all of the evidence in this case, really, is ambiguous at best. It is not definitive at all. And people who are interpreting that piece of evidence do not understand therapy and do not understand psychology. And I think something that's really interesting in the course of investigating this case is that I reached out to people who are, experts in confessions. And by to a T, everyone's like, this is not a confession. This is a tortured person.
Once you think of it that way, it does start to make sense, because you would think if this was a sneaky woman going around murdering babies, it would be unlikely, unless she was, I suppose, schizophrenic, or I don't know, but unlikely to write that everywhere.
Certainly. And again, here is a case of a woman who does not have a history of mental illness, does not have a history of violence, does not have a motive. So for me, I don't know. It's just, to accuse a woman of just out of the blue deciding to commit multiple murders for who knows what reason, you need to have, like, that's an extraordinary claim. And that extraordinary claim deserves definitive evidence. And that is not what exists in this case.
Is there any kind of past that she had, any childhood, they say with psychopaths killing animals and things like that?
No.
One of the things that really struck me, especially because you're an American voice talking about this very British case, in the podcast, in Doubt, which we will link to below, of course. People should go and check that out for more details about this. It's a fantastic podcast, and it's still ongoing as we speak.
In fact, I'm here doing interviews in London in order to continue to pursue how this case continues to unfold, because I think for me, it's not just a case of like what actually happened to these particular babies in this particular hospital. It's blossomed into how did this story get out of control, and also what is really going on in the NHS, which is something that's new to me. Obviously, we do not have a national health service in the United States, and in many ways, like, the NHS is an aspirational thing, right? Like, it's, wow, anybody can just get hurt in the street and get care and doesn't have to like just pay out of pocket for it. Like, what an amazing innovation. We've been, fighting for that kind of thing in the United States for a long time. And the pushback against it in the United States is typically from people who say a national health service is a bad health service. You're just sort of guaranteed to get bad care. And because you're like, you get what you pay for. And if you pay nothing, you get nothing. And what's revealing itself in this case is, unfortunately, evidence of a national health service that is truly in crisis, because people are afraid now to take their children to their local hospital and will instead travel farther, knowing that they're going to get better resources in one hospital versus another.
Have you ever Googled your own name and immediately thought, why have I done this to myself? Because there's a decent chance your address, phone number, relatives, all sorts are sitting on these people search sites. And here's the bit that's grim. It's not just out there, it's being bought and sold by data brokers. Criminals have used data from people search sites to take out fraudulent loans in other people's names. Road rage doesn't always end at shouting. People have used these sites to trace someone via their license plate and show up in real life. That's why I use Incogni. It automatically contacts data brokers on your behalf, demands deletion, and keeps following up so it stays gone. And they've got an unlimited plan with custom removals. So if your info's on some random website, you paste the link and their privacy team works to get it taken down. So go to incogni.com/heretics and use code heretics for 60% off an annual plan. It works out at less than a coffee a month, and there's a 30-day money-back guarantee, so it's risk-free to try.
And that there are problems in understaffing, in training, in resources, in just basic maintenance of the hospital. I mean, have you seen the case of the porters that just from Chester Hospital, the same hospital where Lucy Letby was working? So there's a huge scandal right now because two porters who were working in the mortuary were raised flags that there were bodies that were just left out in the open, that they were being asked to wrap up bodies without any kind of protective equipment. Like they were whistleblowing to their own administration that the conditions in the mortuary were abysmal.
Oh my God.
And instead of fixing those things, the administration retaliated against them and accused them of being necrophiliacs. And they have now just won a judgment against the administration in the hospital. And they are being compensated for how the administration in this very hospital had retaliated against them for whistleblowing against the unsafe conditions in the mortuary. Wow. Same hospital.
So, and that's the Countess, is that the nickname?
The Countess of Chester.
So that's, I've got from the podcast, I was listening, the Countess, isn't it? Well, okay, so, and it's, look, there are amazing things the NHS does as well. And I've, time and time again, I've criticized it, and then the next day had to go in and I've got,
of course,
wow, amazing treatment, free, this is incredible. So, like anything, it's got a bit of both. But it did sort of make me think, wow, we do treat it a bit cultishly. We do, during COVID, everybody was out like banging pots in the street for the NHS. Well, there's something about the NHS. It's like, this is Britain's thing, and this is but really it's portrayed, I think, in your podcast as a kind of elite establishment. And we had this situation where all these babies have terribly, sadly passed away, died, through horrible circumstances, and doctors then rounded on one individual. At the same time, is there room in your mind for that she, and this is the complication. This is a complication even with me interviewing you. At the end of the day, only you know what happened in your case.
I
and
don't think that's the case.
but what I mean is I wasn't there.
Sure.
So I can say I'm 99% sure. Mm-hmm. But would you be able to say you're 100% sure Lucy Letby's innocent?
So I think that I think the international panel of experts that worked independently and came forward and did independent work on this case, and they were highly qualified, they did the thing that no one else did, which was actually carefully examine the conditions and of these babies, and were able to determine the likely actual cause of death in these babies, which was not done before. That said, none of them say definitively, this is exactly what happened, or this is exactly what happened. They give very, very highly plausible explanations in each case for how the baby likely died. That said, there's almost like a safeguarding against really examining what was going on in this hospital. And I think that the public, to this day, deserves to have a more thorough investigation into the conditions of the hospital, especially at the time that these babies died, to better appreciate on a global sense of what was going on. That said, you're right? Someone could argue that a serial killer nurse could have taken advantage of the terrible conditions in order to perpetrate crimes. But even then, I think, and it is the opinion of this international panel, which I think is interesting, that pushes back against the medical evidence that was brought to court and say the medical evidence that was brought to court was wrong, was just wrong. So evidence of air embolism, that's not what it was. Evidence of insulin poisoning, not what it was. They go through each individual case and say that those are not signs, that is a misunderstanding of what the pathology of this baby is. And here is what the actual pathology results reveal. And none of those results reveal intentional wrongdoing. So that's where it's if it were the case of there's still an open question about how these babies die, there's not a definitive answer of how each of these babies died, but there certainly isn't the answer that was presented at court, which was there is undeniable evidence of wrongdoing. And I'm even thinking about this one instance during the trial when this was even posed to Lucy as if it was her job to explain it. It was in the insulin case. That's the case, or the insulin poisoning cases are the ones that everyone treats like a smoking gun. Okay, fine. There's no sign, there's no definitive proof of air embolism, blah, blah, blah. But insulin poisoning, surely we can detect that and know for sure that this was intentional harm because the body only produces a certain amount of insulin and blah, 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 blah. Even in those cases, the actual test that they used to convict Lucy Letby and send her to prison, that test doesn't rise to the level of accuracy that we would use to have, say, to test whether Olympians, athletes can go play in the Olympics. So if that test is not accurate enough to disqualify an athlete from going to the Olympics, why is it enough to send a woman to prison for the rest of her life?
Is there part of you that thinks maybe when we get into there's morality and then there's law, and I suppose I'm asking you, can you be 100% sure that she's innocent? And really, we need to know, can you be 100% sure she's guilty? And if not, or can you at least be 99% or 95%? And if not, then you can't send her to prison for the rest of her life, I
Yeah.
suppose. But then there's that's the legal side of it. Then there's the aspect of you and me as journalists in this case,
Yeah.
speaking about it when there are mothers who are grieving babies,
Sure.
who want closure, who want to know this is the person that did it. And that's when you sort of need to go, okay, well, how sure are we that she's actually innocent? And would you, this is a horrible question I'm going to ask.
Great, let's go.
Yeah.
Give it to me.
Because it's just, well, why not, I suppose. It's a horrible question, but would, if you were having another child, would you, and you knew that Lucy Letby was going to be the nurse at that hospital, would you do it there?
I mean, I wouldn't go to the Countess of Chester
No.
hospital for sure, but if it was at a proper hospital, I think the evidence that has revealed about the quality of care that Lucy Letby was giving to those children was that she was highly qualified. And there isn't evidence to suggest that she intentionally harmed any of these babies. So yeah, I would trust my baby in Lucy
Wow.
Letby's care.
That's quite something.
Yeah, I mean, here's the thing. Like, again, as a journalist, I like to try to be the kind of person who is not going to make definitive claims that I can't back up. But I've had a lot of interaction with the characters that are bringing forth the evidence in this case, including Dr. Dowie Evans, including Dr. Shu Lee, the head of the international panel. And I have found that the process by which Dr. Shu Lee and his panel arrived at their very thorough conclusions about this case, their approach was far more scientific and careful than the process by which the medical experts brought testimony in court. And I have reason to be concerned about the motivations of the medical experts that were brought to court.
Have you spoken to Lucy? Can one speak to somebody in such a...
I mean, one can.
One can.
I have not, principally because it is my understanding that she doesn't want to talk to anyone at this point.
Huh.
And I appreciate that because it's an overwhelming existential crisis situation. And she knows, presumably, that anything she says or does is likely going to be used against her. I know I certainly have felt that, even in the years after my acquittal and release and exoneration, all of that. Like, there is still, I think, an impulse for people to find fault in me and to look at me and what I do in the wrong or in a sort of guilt presumptive light. And so I appreciate honestly her attorney's position that the focus of this case shouldn't be on her and her personality or what she's going through in prison. It should be on the evidence because that's ultimately what matters. And so I wanted to respect that. That said, I've absolutely reached out to her, and I think of the kinds of journalists who are out there, I can appreciate her position much more than others. And also my position about how I feel about her guilt and innocence has evolved over the course of the investigation. Like, I've been burned before. Like, I've strongly advocated for people who I believed to be innocent, only to have done a more thorough analysis of the case and revealed that I was wrong. And so in going into investigating this case, knowing that there was going to be medical evidence and statistical evidence, and knowing that I am an expert in neither of those things, I was wary of taking any kind of strong stance. And ultimately, I agreed to sort of get into this case because I was more interested in the beginning of how this story of a serial killer woman was making the rounds in the media. And also, why is it that her case is the one that is just blowing up in the public imagination and not the case of, say, another contemporaneous nurse who was accused of killing patients that nobody cares about and nobody heard about because it's a man. Like, in 2015, there was another nurse that was found to have been killing patients here in the UK. He was found guilty, all of that. Insulin poisoning. You never heard of him. And nobody heard of him because he's not a woman. And so for me,
babies is quite...
Yes. Yeah. And babies is also emotionally charged. But I think that it ultimately comes down to, here is a young, attractive woman who is being accused of a heinous crime. Now, what truth is there to that? And why is it that we are so enamored of the idea of young, attractive women murdering people?
Is there a part of you, do you think, even subconsciously, maybe you've not even thought about it, that maybe thinks by showing that she's innocent, it furthers, because there are people who still don't believe you, that it furthers your own case in some respect? Look, guys, on an international level, famous, big case, it's often not actually the attractive young woman who did this.
That's an interesting thought. I mean, of course, I can't rule out any subconscious things because they're subconscious. But I think that when I look at Lucy Letby's case, it's very different than my own in the sense that, like, her case is more typical of, again, like I said, women's wrongful conviction cases where there is the mistaken idea that a crime occurred when in fact none occurred. Like that is a very, probable scenario in this case. And that the reason how and why these babies died has a more, natural and nevertheless tragic explanation that doesn't have anything to do with intentional harm. In my own case, there is no question that someone intentionally harmed my roommate. The problem was that they went after the wrong people. And so in that way, our cases are extraordinarily different. And I think that in that case, my case is actually a lot easier because we know who raped and murdered my roommate. Like he went to prison for it. Just because the Italian justice system didn't find him fully accountable doesn't mean that the evidence doesn't speak for itself. He broke into our house and he raped and murdered my roommate. Period. In the cases of crimes that never occurred, you have to prove that a crime didn't occur, which is a very different kind of fact-finding process. And it's a lot more difficult, which I think is one of the reasons why there are so few exonerated women, because so often our cases are circumstantial. It's not about just doing the DNA and discovering, the evidence at the crime scene actually points to this guy who has a history of breaking and entering.
Yeah. And,
aggression towards women, as in my case, right? Like DNA is all over the crime scene and it tells a very specific tale, no matter what, the conspiracy theorists will continue to claim.
And there will be some in the comments.
Well, you know what? Enjoy that. I don't worry about it anymore. In fact, I'm weirdly at this point in my life where I'm kind of over it. Like I'm done feeling like I need to explain myself to the holdouts. I'm just done. Yeah. The evidence is there for everyone to see. And it's not my responsibility to convince everyone because that's not on me. Just like it's not on Lucy to convince everyone that what actually happened to these babies. And that's actually one of the things I was thinking about with the Insulin cases is in court, the prosecutor was like, well, these medical experts say the babies were poisoned. So if it wasn't you, how do you explain it? And she was like, well, I can't explain it.
Yeah, it's not my job.
And it's it's not my job to explain it. I'm just a nurse.
That Netflix documentary about you, I remember watching that a few years ago, and it's mad because the first half, I guess they have to do this for theatrical, the first half, they basically set it up as you definitely did. So I was watching it my God, she definitely did. And then loads of people probably stopped halfway through. Well, I know the answer now, just turn it off. Yeah. And then the second half, it's oh, right. So there was a guy who was this, as you say, a history of aggression and violence and burglary. His DNA is all over her room. He fled the country, I think, at that moment. It seems nuts that but then they said that you did it with this guy. Did you know that guy? Were you know?
I mean, this is a college town. So there are lots of kids running around. I had met him in the vicinity, like I had met a lot of students in the vicinity. He played basketball with the guys who lived downstairs from us. So in the context of these guys are all hanging out together, you know, Meredith and I go down to visit them, say hi, like a very casual hi, like, hi everybody, and then we leave. So like that's my context of ever having met the person who actually committed this crime against my roommate. But I didn't know his name. I didn't have his phone number. There's no history. No witnesses ever came forward to say that they had ever seen us together, or at least no reliable witnesses. There was no history of me and him ever having communication, no text messages, no phone calls, nothing. And also my boyfriend at the time, Raffaele, had never seen Rudy Gaudet in his life. Despite that, the prosecution argued that I was in a secret love triangle with this person. And that was sort of like a necessary part of their case, because how else to explain how this person who seemed so random would be working together with me and my boyfriend when we so clearly had our own little like thing going on. So like what ended up happening in my own case is they arrested the wrong people first, and then they analyzed the crime scene. They realized who the actual perpetrator was. And instead of admitting fault, they orchestrated, like they theorized this preposterous idea, which is that we worked together to rape and murder my roommate in some kind of orgy, and therefore had to theorize that I was in some sort of secret love triangle, which was on the basis of absolutely nothing. So it's just like,
and 4 years in prison.
4 years in prison, 8 years on trial. I'm still like dealing with legal consequences. You know, I'm not over it in the sense that Italy's not over me. They ultimately definitively convicted me of slander based upon the interrogation that I was put through. And I don't know if you want to get into all of the legal stuff around that, because that journey has been wild. Do you want to know the current
I wonder
status
about
of
how
it?
much time we have.
Yeah, I know, right? Like, what are we doing?
I've got you for a certain section here.
Yeah. Here, I'll try to just like explain this really quickly. So through all the levels of my legal journey in Italy, I was found guilty of slander, right? Like they say, even though your interrogation was illegal, even though you were denied an attorney, even though you were denied an appropriate translator, we're still finding you guilty. And once again, I argue that I never would have even been charged with murder had I not been put through that interrogation process. So they find me guilty every time. I appeal to the European Court of Human Rights, and they rule in my favor and say that I never should have been convicted of this crime. And then a law changed in Italy that made it possible for me to take the ruling from the European Court of Human Rights back to Italy to overturn my conviction. And I did that, and I overturned it. But then they sent me back for retrial on the basis of new evidence. So instead of those statements that I signed under duress, those were now stricken from the record as evidence. The only piece of evidence that could be brought to court was a handwritten note that I wrote to retract those statements while I was still in the police office. So I still didn't have an attorney, I still didn't have a translator, but I realized even then that I had been tricked and I had been coerced into signing statements that I could not stand by. I was afraid at that time when I wrote it that they were going to put me in front of a court and have me accuse somebody that I could not accuse of this crime. So I wrote a statement saying, I'm really confused. They put me through all this pressure, but I cannot testify against this person. That's what I wrote. But now the Italian justice system put that forth as evidence of me slandering somebody, saying, even if she's confused, it says here that he might have done it, and so she's guilty.
Right.
And they found me guilty. And so now...
of slandering the man that who worked at it was at the bar
yes,
owner, wasn't it?
Yes. So I worked at a pub, and the night of the murder, he sent me a text message, and I responded to him. And the Italian police misinterpreted that message to mean that I had met with him that night when I said that I didn't. So they said, you're lying. What did you do with him? What did he do? And they convinced me that he was the murderer. They said that I didn't remember it because it was so traumatizing. So like all of that happened. they bring my retraction to court and accuse me of having slandered him in that retraction statement and find me guilty. And so now I'm appealing that again to the European Court of Human Rights.
Oh my gosh. It does feel like they really want to
They want to find me guilty of something.
Yeah. Psychologically, it's one of the it's one of the most complicated things. And now you're seeing this from the journalist side with Lucy Letby, but it's such a complicated thing when you do kind of set your stall out as a journalist, as I've done with you. I've done that in my book. I wrote a book, The Psychology of Secrets, and I wrote all about you and the way that people tried to infer what you were thinking and so on, just from certain looks, or you were kissing Raffaele, and then when you look back at it, you go, well, how could you tell what someone's thinking from that?
Right.
But in a sense, I've set my stall out, and it's a really, really tough thing, because even if you're 99% or 99.9%, there's that little bit of like, well, what if I'm wrong about this? And what an insult that would be in your case to Meredith, or in Lucy Letby's case to the mothers and the fathers, of course, of the babies that were killed. And it's so hard because you go, gosh, how can I mean,
I don't think it's an insult to pursue the truth to the best of your ability. And I think that it is important as a journalist to recognize how you might be prone to certain biases and sort of try to compensate for that in your reporting and take a scientific approach to your own reporting and to challenge it and to ask yourself, what if I'm wrong? And that's an incredibly important part of the process, and that's extremely valuable. And I think that doesn't mean, though, that you can't take a stance that you believe in. And so in this particular case, when it comes to Lucy Letby, I've really wanted to stay away from the question of whether she was guilty or innocent, even though that's what everyone wants a podcast to do, to find out what the truth is. I have, over the course of investigating this case, I have become more and more, not just like concerned, but disturbed with how the evidence was presented in court to the jury, and how not just misleading it was, but also how intentionally misleading it was. So to give you an example, and it's so disturbing to me. Initially, the police, when they started this investigation into the case, they hired a statistician to help them understand this claim that was coming forward from the doctors in the hospital that Lucy Letby was the singular nurse who was always present when these collapses were happening. Could that be definitive proof of her involvement? She gave her report to them, citing that wasn't definitive proof, that there was other, factors and variables that hadn't been considered. And the prosecution in the case removed her from the investigation. So it would have been one thing had they just made a mistake and not, consulted a statistician to understand this specific statistical argument. But they did, and they just didn't like the answer. And so they got rid of it.
Wow.
That disturbs me. And that, to me, is a huge red flag about how the entire investigation and prosecution's case was manufactured and delivered.
There's that Dr. J.
Dr. J-Rum, yeah.
Dr. J-Rum. And he kind of changed. Did he change his testimony a little bit?
Yes. So, yes. And, that to me, especially MP David Davis has made a big argument about this. I think there is room for ambiguity in this particular instance where he might, people's memories are not reliable, right? And so in this case, Dr. J-Rum in court testified to being the one person to have caught her red-handed in doing something, in like harming a baby, which in his testimony was, I walked into this room and I saw her sort of standing over a baby and not touching her, not helping the baby. That was clearly in crisis. And that is so he said he got like a weird feeling. He got like a creepy feeling, a little spidey sense. And he went into the room and saw Lucy Letby sort of just like hovering over this baby that was collapsing and dying right in front of her as she did absolutely nothing. So that was, extremely compelling testimony in court. But his own notes from prior, when this actually happened, was that Lucy Letby had called him in for help, and that he had not gotten a spidey sense at all, but that she had called for help from the doctor. And so that tells a very different tale. And like, is that intentional, or is that his memories sort of being rewritten over the course of this investigation as he's sort of like, I think it is human. And because I understand, witness testimony now is unreliable for this reason, is that as soon as like an idea gets into their head, people revisit their memories and reinterpret them, and can even change their own memories in order to sort of better fit into this story. And I think the thing that's concerning about Dr. Jairam is, consciously or not, he sees himself as the one who caught the serial killer, who was the first one to who was the one who was on the ground, catching her red-handed, raising the alarm, getting ignored by all of his like higher ups, and like he's sort of the superhero of the story. And indeed, he sort of was going on and like as the trial was taking place, talking with producers of TV shows who wanted to make a scripted series, turning like about how he was the guy who found the serial killer. And so like I could see there being an unconscious and not just a willful lying necessarily. But the fact of the matter is that the jury only heard his testimony in court, not what his actual notes, where he describes in email what happened to his colleagues. It tells a very different tale. And so, and again, like a very prejudicial one.
This is all just remarkable, because I know this is going to make a lot of people we watching will be very angry right now with both of us. And then a lot of people will be going, my God, this needs to be looked at again. That Dr. Jairam as well, I didn't realize was a bit of even beforehand, was he a bit of a celebrity doctor?
Yeah, I mean, yes. And again, like, I don't want to say that just because someone has been on, reality TV, that somehow disqualifies them. I don't think that. However, I do think that it adds a wrinkle into what could potentially be an even unconscious motivating factor in the interpreting of this scenario. Like, one thing that I really want to make clear is that when I approach these kinds of situations, and I get concerns, and I even, feelings of like being deeply disturbed, like this very intentional, just wiping aside of a statistical report that didn't, support the theory of intentional harm. That to me is harder for me to explain away. But I typically try to assume that if there is some kind of fault or mistake, or just something is some kind of wrongdoing is happening, I try to imagine what how it's unintentional before I imagine that it is intentional, right? Like, I really try to give the benefit of the doubt, because I do know, like, even from my own case, that people can make grave mistakes and cause unimaginable harm without even realizing that they're doing it. Like, and can I believe to this day that like my prosecutor convinced himself of what he presented in court, even though it was on the basis of absolute wild speculation, like his own wild speculation. But to him, if you grant all of the false premises that he grants himself, like he doesn't believe that the break-in in my house, like in my house, was real. Well, if you don't believe that, if that's your premise, if you believe 100%, if you're 100% certain that the break-in was staged, well, then that logically means a number of conclusions. But you can't, like, that was his mistake, was assuming that his gut feeling about the break-in was 100% right.
He comes across a little bit, like someone who's watched too many movies, that prosecutor.
Yeah, he's watched something. I don't know. I mean...
But what you're describing there is Hanlon's razor. Never attribute malice to that, which can be explained by, I guess, human fallibility. They say stupidity, but I don't think that's quite right.
Yes. Yeah.
And I try to go in with that as well, and it's very difficult for people. And I think people, even who think now that or know that you are innocent of that crime, it wasn't you. It's almost like they want to punish you a little. It's like, well, there were some dodgy things in the so. But the thing, what's really hard for people is like, no, you've either got to treat her as murderer or not just innocent, but somebody who was given the worst, like most horrible 4 years in an Italian prison. Like most of us can never even imagine that. So everybody, unless they do think you're guilty, then terrible, horrible. But then if they think you're innocent, they should be. I'm so sorry, Amanda, that these people and the British press did this to you. And unfortunately, what's going to happen is people, because of that, they're just going to. And so, do you find that they treat you just? We were talking off air before about the papers. This sort of like, well, she's probably maybe innocent, but even so,
yes,
is there that?
She should. Yeah. So obviously, this is my first time in the UK. This is my first time in London. I've been very, I was nervous about coming here because, to this day, I'm routinely punished, I think. Like, I think there's this sort of impulse to punish me and to find fault in me and to criticize all of my work, my life, my intentions on the part of a certain faction of the British press that's like just very married to the idea of me being at fault somehow for what happened to Meredith. Even like, for example, I think there's this impulse to find fault in me for her erasure from the story, right? Like I think there's an accurate complaint that you hear from her own family, for instance, that like the truth of what happened to her got lost in the weeds of this scandalous trial and the scandalous coverage around me. And the impulse is to find fault in me for that. But I'm not the one who's responsible for that. And I think that like, because I'm the name and the face that people associate with this issue, I'm the one who is sort of held responsible for that, as opposed to the people who actually have responsibility for that, the Italian, law enforcement and the British press. Like, those are the people who are writing the headlines. Those are the ones who are doing this crazy conspiracy theory in court. Like, I was just a 20-year-old kid whose roommate just got murdered, and then I was thrown in prison for it. Like, that's it. So what's interesting for me, though, and this is something that I'm still trying to wrap my head around and try to understand, and maybe you have a thought about this. I don't know if you've thought about this. But this impulse to like find fault in me and so the Daily Mail, me coming here to London is like, what gall does she have to come here? She should apologize for being here. Like, every time that she sort of asserts her story, it's at the expense of Meredith and her family. Like, there's this like idea that like, there's this like sunk cost fallacy, the zero sum equation, where as the more I tell my story, the more it diminishes her story somehow, which is wrong. Like, it's just wrong. But I don't see that same kind of reaction with a lot of male wrongly convicted people. So, no one has ever, at least as far as I know, said that like there's a very famous case in the United States of the Central Park Five, and they've, self-rebranded as the Exonerated Five, rightfully so, because the Central Park Five was the accusation that everyone used to say that they had raped this poor, woman who was raped in Central Park and left to die. And to my knowledge, no one has ever criticized them for telling their story and claimed that it was at the expense of the victim in this case. But I get that all the time. And so I'm curious, do you have any thoughts? But you're someone who thinks about psychology a lot. Why is there an impulse to find fault in me for telling my story of institutional injustice, and in other cases there isn't?
I think there's probably a few things. I think definitely the fact that you're a woman, I think that definitely plays a role in it. I think there was a nationalistic thing going on, wasn't there? Because I gather that in America it was like, hey, they've incarcerated our girl. Yeah. And in the UK it was like, she's killed our girl.
Right.
And that, there's the sunk cost fallacy, as you say. The newspapers have gone so far, they have to just keep going now, because otherwise they have to say, gosh, I've been slandering an innocent woman who...
Shoot.
Yeah. Who
Gee whiz, can't do anything. Well, I mean, and that's that sunk cost fallacy though, right? I think that's going to be a very similar thing that is an issue in the Letby case, where there are some who theorize that this whole case kind of got out of control. That originally she was just not liked because she was such a diligent nurse, and that she was blowing the whistle on unsafe conditions in the hospital, and that the administration was retaliating against her by saying, oh, you're blowing the whistle? Well, we're just going to blame you for the deaths. And that it got out of control. Some people think that the administration that originally pointed the finger at Lucy Letby just wanted her to go away. And this was the way to make her go away. And then suddenly it blew up. Now, I don't know that, but that is something that I am concerned about. And I don't think people should ignore the case of these porters from the very same hospital who were retaliated against by the administration for raising concerns about the conditions in the mortuary. It's just, I do not think that is a coincidence that was happening at the same hospital.
One of the other issues that is cleared up in your podcast is the issue of the deaths stopping once she was gone.
Yes.
Something else happened at the same time that isn't reported.
Well, and I don't understand why it's not reported. Actually, I do understand why it's not reported, because it doesn't play with the same story. But the fact that at the same time that they remove Lucy Letby from the unit, they also downgrade the unit, and they're no longer taking the most vulnerable babies. So the babies that were dying were not babies that were healthy born babies. These were premature babies that were, in a lot of these cases, were triplets or twins. So already in unstable conditions, and were very likely not receiving the adequate care at this hospital. And as soon as it downgraded, they were no longer taking those kinds of cases. So of course there's going to be fewer deaths. Again, it's all of this is information that has always been there. Everyone already had that information, and yet that information is ignored because it leads to a more ambiguous story.
If Lucy is actually innocent, and I don't know how I feel, I'm in a dazed state since listening to your podcast.
I've been in a dazed state. Honestly, I've been in a dazed state because, again, I didn't know what to think going into this. I'm not a medical expert. I'm not a statistician. All I am is somebody who has learned to be very good at critically thinking about these kinds of issues through sheer force. And I have just become more and more shocked and dismayed by what I have discovered in digging deeper and seeing what was already there in plain sight, but which people were either consciously or unconsciously not willing to take into consideration. And
yeah. Well, there'll be a whole flurry of, everyone's going to have a different opinion watching this. And I want people to comment and tell me what they think based on what you're saying, based on your podcast as well. But if she is innocent, what has to happen now?
So right now, there's a filing, an appeal to the CCRC. And depending on how they rule, if they rule that there's no case, then it ends. There's nothing they can do. If they recommend it to the Court of Appeals, the Court of Appeal can right there and then say this conviction is unsafe, and they would give the option to the prosecution to retry, and the prosecution could decide whether or not they wanted to retry the case. If the prosecution decided not to, she would be immediately released right then and there at the Court of Appeals. If she was retried and acquitted, she would be released. If she was retried and convicted, then she would face that whole process all over again with the CCRC. But there are a lot of ifs, and a lot of it depends upon the will of people to potentially go against a very strong prevailing narrative, and potentially at personal expense due to that, like at personal social expense. And I think one of the things that I found most moving in the course of this, of investigating this case, is the willingness of people to put their own personal and social lives and professional lives at risk by sticking their neck out for someone that they feel is an innocent person who might die in prison. And they just, now that they know what they know, they can't live with the idea of just going about their life without doing something about it. And just on a personal level, the same thing was happening with me. Some people just couldn't and wouldn't ignore it when so many people were willing to. And I think that I think speaks volumes. Then again, they all could be wrong. And I, but I'd say just listen, because that's what I've been doing. I've been just listening. I've been critically listening, but I've been listening. I've not been turning a blind eye. And even when I started sort of poking around at the very beginning of all of this, I encountered journalists who just were like, you know what? There may be more to this story, but we can't touch it because of how toxic it is. It's just some journalists I've talked to were afraid of even going there with this case because they felt that it would come, if they went there, it would come at such a personal risk to themselves. And so they were like, you know what? Before I even encounter anything that's going to make me feel bad, I'm just going to avoid the subject entirely. And I don't think that we should live in a world where anyone should be afraid of approaching the truth because it comes at too much of a personal risk.
This is exactly why I do this channel. So this is exactly the reason. So whether people think innocent, guilty, or they just want to look into it a little bit more, that's why we do this. People, let me know in the comments what you think. Make sure to get Doubt. You'll get so much more information. That's on all the podcast places. Mouth of the Wolf is a documentary all about what's happening now with Amanda Knox's story. That's on Hulu and Disney+. Hit the like button and keep watching this channel.